As you know, we kicked this off with the idea and this like alliteration and rhyming of the Grindset mindset, which is all too clever. But the idea is everybody knew what it meant. The minute you say it, everybody's like, of course, it's the grind. You know the grind. We're living in the grind. All of you, by virtue of being here, are every single one of you in some kind of influence of this kind of culture. What is it? Well, it's hard to say, but you know it when you see it. It's that extreme kind of intensity that characterizes a lot of high-performing, high kind of funnel, narrow, like high-achieving cultures. And it's very all-consuming. The interesting thing is, even if you think you're not part of it, those of you who are like, oh, I'm a slacker, and then I talk to you, and then you feel guilty for what you did last weekend. You're like, I should have been working. I'm really far behind. And that's, your guilty confessions are the tribute that you pay to grind culture. Grind culture is that powerful. Even when you're not part of it, you kind of give obeisance to it. So with that starting, we wanted to ask our speakers who, again, come at it from decades of thinking and encountering very, very old traditions of wisdom in the most intense areas of life. So you kind of go to the extremes and find out what works there. It's a good way to kind of come back and say, well, then what can we do here? So I want to open it up, and maybe I'll start with you, Mike, if that's okay, to just kind of talk about both of you have been in kind of environments of the grind and seen its limits. There are ways in which planning and working hard and really having that high intensity is an adaptive behavior. It works really well. It gets you far until it doesn't. Until somehow, at the bigger scope of life problems, it doesn't seem to be the right way to attack that, of how to live a good life. It gets you a good internship maybe, but not a good life. So I'll kick it off to you to start us off to how to think through that.
Thanks, Vivek. Can you all hear me with the microphone? Super, I'm very happy to be here, thank you. When I was in college, this is the kind of stuff we talked about all the time, in the classroom and outside the classroom. And I wondered about this, what do you want out of life? So I study the classics, and I'm very, very invested in the ancient wisdom tradition. That might sound quaint to you to put it that way, but I firmly believe that a lot of very smart people refined ideas over the ages. And what do you want about life? And one of the most important things that I've taken away from that is you actually have to stop and think. What do you want out of life? And they have an ancient technique for doing this. There's a sort of a finite number of values people have in this world. When you're at Cornell right now, it can be hard to see that, right? Because you mostly are following rules, and every one of you people has done amazing things to get here, and you're still doing them. And when you're in the throes, you don't see it. But the ancient philosophers talk about what they call the summum bonum, the best thing in the world, greatest thing in the world. And it's going to be your highest value. And so years ago, I thought about this. Sit down with a piece of paper and talk about what's the most important thing to you. And I invite you to think about this, right? Is it health? Is it wealth? Is it status? Is it power? Is it independence? Those are the 5 sort of classic things people think about. And there's an ancient question that would help you decide this. I'm going to ask you to think. You don't have to shout out your answer. What do you think is worse, physical pain or social disgrace? Cicero asked this question in a book written for a college-age audience about 2,000 years ago. And the instant answer everybody blurts out is physical pain. And he says, all right, let's think about that. Everybody's going to say that. He says, but really think about that. And there's plenty of examples for people that's not true for. And he gives a couple of familiar examples. Think about athletes. I bet some of you are athletes in here, right? You ever run really hard to win a race? What do you get at the end? A little ribbon. You put your body through a ton of pain for nothing, and so forth. So those are some of the cognitive strategies of helping you figure out what you want most out of this life. I'll just give you a quick story, and I'm going to keep it a bit vague, but I hit a real tragedy in my own life about 4 years ago. I don't think anybody makes it to my age without something like this happening. And I took a kayak. I survived the tragedy. It was not easy, but I took a kayak trip around the lake at a relative's house. And I said, the first half of life is over. So what do I want out of the second half? I met every goal I'd ever set for myself with the Grindset mindset. Really push hard, do well in school, achieve tenure, all these great things. And now that's done. What am I going to do now? And so thinking cognitively about that and talking to other people, but mostly thinking is a great way to do it. Maybe that's a good start.
Well, hard to top that. I was going to talk about the Grindset mindset. You had asked Vivek about maybe how we experience this and how we see it not pan out. I'll tell you a couple of New York City stories. So I live in New York City. Talk about, anybody here from New York? I know there's at least one. Yeah, right? Grindset mindset. It's the only way to live, right? Even if you're just trying to get on the subway, it's the only way to live. So when I first moved to New York, I was having some tech problems, and it was 11 o'clock at night. Now you might ask, Lydia, why were you working at 11 o'clock at night? Well, right? So I emailed my tech guy at 11 o'clock at night thinking he could address it in the morning. By 11:15, I had an answer, and the tech problem was solved, right? But that Grindset mindset, what do I see? How do I see it play out? I can tell you that nationwide, more than half of medical students are reporting depression and anxiety that's crippling, right? There is a way in which we are cultivating generations of strivers, and certain locations and certain universities are doing that in different ways that are more or less pernicious. But the mental health issues among my students are real and tangible, and we're actively trying to figure out how to mitigate those. But among my colleagues, fellow physicians who saw themselves going into a life of service, more than 62% of my colleagues are reporting symptoms of burnout. So really widespread unhappiness. And I think going back to Mike's initial comments, you know, we do need to be asking ourselves, what is it that we want from life? And I think maybe part of how this conversation will go both around the tables and between us is the kinds of questions we ask will probably be very different. And then the way that we answer these questions may be very different, but I think that could be some of the fruit of tonight's conversation to try to get toward that.
Yeah, that's a good transition into your recent book projects, which both, in a sense, deal with the extremes here. So for those of you, if you've been in business culture a little bit, you'll go to these conferences on leadership or something, and they'll be like, here's this SWAT team, veteran who's going to talk to a bunch of corporate CEOs about leadership. You might want to wait, why that? Or here's this, extreme marathon runner or something. And I said, well, the idea is there's some sort of connection between life at the extremes and kind of coming back to well, how do I attack the problems I have today? And both of you have projects which we were really excited about and seeing that came out in the last couple of years about life at the extremes and your very particular experiences and scholarly work around them. So I want to give you a chance to kind of come in and say a little bit about those projects. And so the thing that I think the convergence, where it actually sounds like you actually start in a somewhat similar place, even though you have very different kind of religious perspectives, let's say. In Cicero, for example, you have a lot of stuff around facing reality and recognizing the kind of tragic dimension of life that it's very hard to naturally do unless you've encountered a lot of it. And then you have a kind of conversation around finitude that I want you to get into. So I'll let you kind of start off and say maybe a little bit about Cicero and what that project was like and how it bears on this particular conversation.
Sure, thanks. So I translated a book last year before, I forget, and it's a recreation of an ancient speech by a guy named Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero. He was born in 106 BCE and assassinated in the year 43. So that's 43 years before the birth of Jesus. And in this artistic recreation, it is him dealing with the grief of the death of his daughter. He had a daughter named Tullia. She died in giving birth to a child at the age of 32. And he totally fell to pieces. We know from his biography that she was the light of his life. He loved her more than anything. And it's a recreation of an ancient speech that was seen as a great source of solace for generations. And so he goes through strategies. How do you deal with, I think what most people consider the absolute most stressful thing in human existence, the death of a child. It reverses the natural order of everything, right? I mean, there's all kinds of tragedies, but that's at the top. And so he consolidates a lot of the ancient wisdom. This is a lot of what you talk about in your own book, Lydia. So and it's real for you in a particular way. But there is one great takeaway to prepare for this kind of thing. But for the other stresses we were hearing about, more maybe at your age, breakups or being denied admission to some opportunity that you've applied for, and it's preparing now. You want to prepare now for tragedy. This is what he says. Because tragedies are inevitable in human life. There are no human lives that, it may not hit you personally, but it's going to hit some of us in this room. It's going to hit some of the loved ones, many of us in this room. It probably will hit, who knows? But it's going to happen. And if you haven't ever thought about it, cognitively sat down and thought, what does this mean? When it does hit, all the ancient philosophers said you're going to fall to pieces. And it's a lot trickier, a lot harder to pull out of than sitting down now and thinking. You know, the ancients would say that birth itself is a death sentence. There are no exceptions. You've got to come to grips with that however you can do it, and so on. And there's much more we could say about that, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on the same topic, really, and your own perspective.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a primary care doctor. It's kind of like when you go to your pediatrician. I'm the grown-up version of that. So I meet with people mostly when they're well, but I also sometimes see patients in the hospital as well. But what does that mean? That means that I take care of adults. And who are the adults who go to the doctor? Well, they tend to be older than 60 on the whole. Often even older, the people who come regularly. Younger people may have a doctor, but often don't go. So that means that the vast majority of my doctor's visits are with people who are thinking about or maybe trying to avoid thoughts of death. Now, it's interesting the way Jacob presented this. I don't remember his exact language, but he made it sound like, death is not a fact of your lives. But the truth is that death is the only thing that's guaranteed, because we know that the rich get out of paying taxes, right? It used to be death and taxes, but taxes are pretty much optional in this country. So it's death. So while you may not see yourselves as being particularly near the end, there is no reason why you should not examine your life in light of your finitude or your finiteness. So why would we even want to think about this? In a similar way to what you're saying, Mike, when we have a sense of the end, we reassess what matters most. And so if you live sort of cavalierly, you're never going to die, you're invincible. This is why, 18-year-olds often get into car accidents, whatever, right? You do stupid things when you're young, everybody talks about that. But if you live as though you're invincible and death is not a reality and will never be a reality, you also don't start to put things in order in terms of importance, right? So you may have had an experience with a grandparent, or God forbid, with a parent who does become ill. Some of you probably had experiences during COVID of losing someone close to you or to your family. And that you instantly start reassessing those relationships and what matters and how am I spending my time and where am I spending my holidays, and did I call my mother last Mother's Day, and who am I writing letters to, all of those questions. But it's because there's a sense of the end. And so a different way to say this is that death or the idea of limits in general help bring into relief. They help make more obvious that which is most important to us. And so that's the work that I've been trying to do with my patients. If death is a reality for all of us, then how can we live more intentionally, live more deliberately, live better, not getting hung up on the fact that we're going to die, but just acknowledging that we are finite creatures. How does that translate into not only dying better one day, but living better now?
And maybe you could say a little bit about where the gap comes between, let's say that you have a lot of haunting stories, really gripping stories in your book about where that gap comes in failing to, in a sense, recognize finitude.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, goodness. So I think of one patient where when patients are being difficult, doctors get called. This is the language that's often used by the staff. And so the nursing called me and said, this Miss So-and-so is being very difficult. And so I went to her bedside and I asked Miss So-and-so, what's going on? And it turned out, actually, she was in a bit of an existential crisis. She was actively dying and she was aware that her body was shutting down. And she was also aware that she'd been very much a pull herself up by her bootstraps kind of person. She didn't need anybody in her life. She sort of worshipped at the altar of independence. Fine, we've all been there in our lives. But that also meant that she never thought about what the answers were to the big life questions. And now that she's dying, what's next? And she had never considered that question. She'd never allowed herself to consider that question long enough to come to an answer that gave her peace. And so now she was in total internal chaos as she was physically declining. And to be honest, with that particular patient, the reason why that story was so haunting for me, and I hadn't forgotten it, is because really it was too late to have a really good conversation with her because she was just so close to the end.
Yeah, and then similarly in the advice, let's call it pseudo-Cicero, can we call it? Which, by the way, you should buy Mike's book and read, because he's the one who actually figured out this was not Cicero, which is a crazy story in itself. I think it's really neat that you figured that. But it's such a good, it captures, like you say, it captures Cicero so well and the way he approached it. What is it that Cicero was looking around and seeing as like the problem if you fail to grasp this finitude, and I would just say, and you, Mike, as you look around the world, where is it that you're like, this is where we could use a dose of that?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's the Grindset mindset. I look around and I see striving everywhere. I say that as somebody, by the way, who grabbed a brass ring at a young age and got everything I ever wanted. But I don't see everybody else grabbing the brass ring and being happy with it. I see a lot of people striving and not getting what they want. And Cicero says the exact same thing, or pseudo-Cicero, in this very book that you're saying. There's a section in there, he says, a lot of people reach the end of life and they have assumed it's going to go on forever. And they freak out at the very end. They've never actually paused to think it can't last forever. We've never seen anybody live beyond this. So I think that is one of the interesting points of contact, and the talking about the values of life and how we want to reset them. I wanted to talk about an issue, though, that I thought came up at the very beginning of your book, and see if maybe you could expand on it, because it's an issue that means a lot to me as a classics professor, and it's the medicalization of life, or the medicalization of death. And I don't know if you even know this term, right? I don't think I had heard it in college, the medicalization. I used it once in my administrative role, and people start raising eyebrows. I said, relax. I'm not making words up. But you talk, when people cling to life at all costs, what does that mean, right? What are we going to do to try and save somebody's life? And this is what I think is your opening anecdote in the book. It's really gripping. I haven't stopped thinking about it since I read it. Because you can bring people back to life, can't you? My great Latin teacher, they brought him back to life 3 times.
Yeah, well, that's what we try to do. I actually was talking about this recently in the hospital with a room full of residents, so junior doctors, and I said, how many, I told them the story of attempting resuscitation on that gentleman 3 times, the patient, the story I tell. And one of the young doctors raised her hand. She said, Dr. Dugdale, I attempted resuscitation 7 times in the same night on the same person. So this person died 7 times and was successfully resuscitated, well, however the math, 6 times. The 7th resuscitation was a failure. But yeah, I mean, I can riff on that if you want me to. But.
Well, because you talk about what does that mean, right? Like a lot of people are like, wow, I don't want to die, right? Like if you can bring me back to life, that would be amazing. But you write about what that entails. So you have to break people's ribs. Mm-hmm. The quality, you might get an extra hour out of one of these resuscitations as opposed to preparing to die a dignified death. The Cicero book actually talks about that. He talks about people who would have been happier had they died before they saw some of these things. And so there's a point made in the book where he says, if you want to see what makes somebody happy, you have to look at the entire career. You have to look at the end. Because a lot of people, careers, they end badly. Yes. Almost every leadership position ends badly. If you ever look at politicians, it's always a failure at the end. So some people would be better off stopping shy of getting those goals. And so I just thought it was really profound what you talk about, because you have to talk to families, I think this is what you write, who say, no, we want you to try anything it takes to save our loved one, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, so what medicine has made possible is not only dodging these questions that Cicero was asking and that we're asking, but medicine has now added the veneer of making basically death optional. because we have technology that can really maintain the vital functions of human bodies almost indefinitely. I don't know, I won't ask if anybody in here is squeamish. I'm going to assume no one is. But there are people in my hospital right now that are literally decomposing inside as we maintain their vital functions on life support. They are still alive, but they're actively dying. But patients or families or the state in New York, if a patient doesn't have anyone to represent them, the state is very strict about we have to do everything we can to maintain life if there's a possibility of survival to discharge. So maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room in that last category, but often we'll have patients or their families insisting on using the apparatus of medicine until well beyond the point that there's any possibility of this medicalization doing any good at all. It won't lead to survival, and it's really so then the question becomes, well, where's the line between dragging out the dying process and prolonging life? And when you get to the dragging out the dying process and you're no longer prolonging life in a meaningful way, that's where a lot of doctors sort of try to talk to families about holding back. But I'll also say this. I have many physician colleagues who themselves are afraid to talk to patients about their dying. Because there are many doctors, even though they see death routinely, they have not ever sat with these questions either. They have never come to a place of peace in their own answers to life's big questions. And so there was one of my colleagues said to me, I don't even know why you write books about death, and I don't know why you talk to patients about death. She said, I am so afraid to die. I do everything I can to avoid telling my patients when they're dying. And this is a primary care doctor. If your primary care doctor is not going to tell you, who's going to tell you? So medicalization has only sort of reified or reinforced the idea that we don't need to think about these questions of ultimacy.
Yeah. Can I make that's why it's bracing to read the extreme cases. But an issue that I've noticed over the course of my adult life is the medicalization of all of our unhappiness. And I bet that's going to resonate with some people in the room. That's an American point of view. It's a recent point of view. But so we're going to medicalize away the end of life, but are we medicalizing away some of the big questions in connection with the Grindset mindset, right? We're going to work. So how are we going to work and keep working? We keep taking substances. It's going to allow us to keep going. I'm shocked when people tell me some of the things they're taking to write a term paper for my class. I say, no, we can find a better way. And I'm sure there's much more of that kind of thing happening.
But also the elimination of disability, too. So, we can run genetic profiles on fetuses in utero and then decide which lives we don't think are worth living. But what does it do when, there's a beautiful article in The Atlantic, which I commend to you, I think in 2015, on the disappearance of Down syndrome. And that's part of the medicalization. In a sense, it's sort of a, what do they say, like positive eugenics, right? Or maybe it's a negative eugenics, because you're eliminating the fetuses that would go on to be babies and children who have the disabilities, because then we can be more productive, right? We can go into the grind more, because then as a mother or a father, I'm not constrained by having to care for a child who's very dependent on me. So I agree. We were talking a little bit about organ transplantation over dinner too. I mean, we are medicalizing every aspect of life.
Maybe we can move into even further away from the end of life kind of situations that you have in hospital to like the more general kind of problems and projects that we have in our lives. So because your book does a really nice job of illustrating a kind of mindset, which looks exactly like the Grindset mindset, that is really kind of fatal or toxic. When it comes into like, now you have this advanced medical technology, you can just be like, we're going to beat this cancer. We're going to just keep going. And you're in denial about like the finitude and the recognition. If you work backwards, suppose, let's talk about the good case. Suppose you have someone who's like, okay, I want to start differently. So how would you have us do it? So if I were a student, I'd want to say a little bit like in favor of the Grindset right here and be like, okay, that's fine for end of life, great. But I got to get through this year and this semester and I got some papers and exams coming up. And I got to stick with this. How would the traditions you've studied counsel like rethinking my choices today? Like what should I be doing now? Not just for my end of life planning in my like living will, but like also for like out beyond that.
Well, that's not a small question, but yeah, so how are you going to fix it? I mean, number one, I wouldn't change anything right now as we sit over the dinner table, but what do you want? Are you at Cornell so that you can get into grad school of some kind? The answer to that question is usually yes. Say, all right, why do you want to go to grad school? So I can get the job doing X. All right, that's great. Why do you want the job doing X? So I can make a lot of money and have a prestigious job. I'm not against any of that, by the way. I think that stuff's great. But so why do you want a lot of money? That's where things start. You don't get beyond that question too often because it's taken as a given that a lot of money is a good thing. In fact, people who study this, they say that, you may already know this, a lot of money to a certain degree is a good thing. You don't want to be poor. Being poor is not a good idea. But being phenomenally rich doesn't really make you happy either. You got to have a minimum number. The last time I saw the minimum number, it was 75 grand a year. That was probably 10 years ago, so it's going to be beyond that today. But making $2 million a year, $5 million, I'll take it. But what am I going to do with it? I'm going to put it in the bank, and I'm not going to do anything different than I'm doing now. So you want to try and find a partner in life who shares these values, assuming most of you want to partner up in life. So you got to keep thinking, what's the next thing? And then, what do you want to do to get there, right? Are you unhappy now? I get the sense that a lot of people at Cornell are a bit unhappy because they're studying all the time or they're in their silos, and that might cause you to reassess your priorities and start changing some things that you're doing.
Okay, so I have a very different take on this, and I kind of have too many things in my head right now. Okay, so let me start with this. I will say that I think there are seasons to work really hard. And so you just don't make it through medical school if you don't work really hard. You don't make it through your term papers if you don't sit down and write the thing, right? So there are seasons to put in the work. And then there's the question of calling, which we talked about a bit over dinner. And this people make sense of in different ways, but do I have a deep sense that what I am doing matters in the big scheme, whether because it will translate into a life of service or a life of teaching, or it will allow me to invest in communities or whatever. How does what I am doing, how do I have a sense of purpose in what I am doing? Because if there is a sense of purpose or mission or call, the idea that you would work really hard at that isn't quite the same as, I just want to get the job at Goldman Sachs and just make bank and like live the good life, right? There's very different ways. So how is, whether it's calling, whether it's a religious or secular notion of calling, or meaning or purpose, how does those sorts of questions, how does that lens help you make sense of where you're at? And in part, college is kind of a season and maybe it leads to something, but asking the questions about meaning and purpose in your goals with college and grad school or beyond, first job, I think are really important. So there's that stuff. I want to say it's okay to work really hard for seasons, but it is important to be aware that seasons have their limits. Thinking about meaning and purpose and calling is really critical. But then there's this sort of third camp, which I thought you were going to go to. So since I'm a non-classicist, I'm going to riff on it anyway. We talk a lot with the medical students about cultivating virtues. Which another way you could think of them are good habits of character, good character traits. In medicine, we talk a lot about solidarity with patients, honesty, being a technically competent physician. It's not quite a virtue, but there's space for that, right? So what kind of person am I becoming? Am I a person of courage, of integrity? Do I live an integrated life where the kind of doctor I am in the hospital and the kind of professor I am in the medical school and the kind of mom I am at home, that there's an integrity there that doesn't just go away when I don or doff my white coat, right? And so I think all of us can be attending now to how we cultivate these various virtues so that when we meet difficulty, we are equipped to respond, because we cannot control suffering, right? Then somebody said life is to live is to suffer. Maybe that was Nietzsche. To live is to suffer. But we can choose how we can respond to suffering, and cultivating virtue, a life of virtue, helps us respond to suffering, I think in a better, healthier, more robust way.
So I agree with all that, and I put it in a much more stark fashion. I've got a friend here in town who's made some pretty poor choices in life. He's my friend, though, and he told me something years ago I've never forgotten. He said, "You don't get it, Mike." He said, "Most people can't look themselves in the mirror without flinching." I've never forgotten that. And he said, "You sleep well at night, so you don't understand." He said, "But there's so much misery out there, people who can't sleep well at night. How do you do this? You cultivate the classical virtues." Some of you may have heard of these. There were 4 in the classical tradition. You'll find, so there are going to be some Stoic fans out here. There's always Stoic fans in a crowd. Stoics, Platonists, everybody in the ancient world cultivated these, and they wound up within Christianity. The 4 classical virtues were wisdom, justice, fortitude, which is a way of saying courage or endurance, and moderation. The 4th is probably most important. That's what they usually say. Moderation, reasonableness, limits, of that kind of thing. And when you can approach a decision you have to make with those 4 criteria, you can sleep well at night. You can look at yourself in the mirror.
I have to tell you a story. I like writing books on death. I like to read stories about really old people. And I read a story in the newspaper about a really old lady, and somebody said, "How did you live to be whatever, 100 and something?" And she said, "Every night when I got ready for bed, I would ask myself if I had any regrets. And I would take care of it before I went to bed." So every night went to bed with no regrets. And in a way, that's like a mini finitude, right? You're saying this is the limit. Everything has to be resolved every night. I need to have peace with my neighbors, whatever, right? My mini finitude is every night. Actually, the Catholic tradition, I'm sure there's somebody Catholic here. There's something called I think it's called like the evening examen, or the examen, where every night before bed you sort of reflect on your day and kind of take care of that. So I think that's what this lady was doing, kind of the nightly examen.
So I want to try and get a sense of where you might diverge too, because so far we've been in kind of too much agreement. You need to start getting to some places where you actually disagree. So one of the ways I think is you have this sharp divide when you think about total like human projects of life and mortality, of thinking about, well, what's past it? Mm-hmm. And that's a really like kind of thorny one, because it's like that might make a difference, might have some impact in how you think about what the projects are right here, given that. And it can go in multiple directions, not always well. I mean, you can have a lot of problems in both directions, I think. But maybe you could speak a little bit. So, for example, in your book, you've talked a little bit about, say, the largest religious category fastest growing one, like a spiritual but not religious kind of view, which is something you see, and you've kind of noticed some things about it. I don't know if you want to say about how does that impact end of life kind of thought. And then you can actually, let's hear Lydia first, and then we'll kind of take it from there.
Yeah, so I think we diverge before we get to the end of life, and that is the question of whether we are sort of masters of our own lives, or whether we are responding to a master of our life. So in the Christian tradition, and I'm a practicing Christian, there's this idea that life comes from God, that sort of God is the author and creator of life. And therefore, we can choose to live sort of aligned with God, or we can kind of choose our own adventure, you know? And it might be a perfectly good adventure. Actually, this reminds me of a line by C.S. Lewis, who says something about we are so content, we're like children in the slums, so content making mud pies in the sand while there is, a beach holiday awaiting us, right? So there's a way in which I think in the Christian tradition, one could say that, yeah, you can actually create for yourself a very good life. It could be a very good life, but it is always going to be mud pies compared to the beach holiday, if it is not aligned with the sort of best life, sunum bonum. How's my Latin?
Very good.
All right. I'm a wannabe. If it's not the sunum bonum that God has for us, and so then part of the Christian experience is trying to discern: am I sort of aligned or not aligned with what I'm trying to figure out is God's will for my life? And people have all different ways of sort of tackling that question. So I don't know where you come down on that, but we may diverge even right here on the questions of the good life.
That's right. The ancients, before Christianity, have no conception of what you just described. There's no such thing as a personal relationship with God. There are gods, and they talk extensively, and some people believe in them, many people believe in them, others do not, so there are atheists in the ancient world as well. So the ancients don't have this idea of aligning with God in any particular way, but they do have this idea of choosing your priorities given that God is not part of the equation, right? So, for example, we were talking over dinner, Stoicism, some of you are familiar with, their idea, they believe in intelligent design. This is an argument that's usually attributed to Christianity. It's a Stoic idea. They have this idea of God's plan, whatever it means. They call it providence, but it was the idea that something has been set in motion, and you can buck against it, but you may not get what you want. But then when you get away from that, you get into the Platonic tradition. That's what Cicero was sort of a follower of. And Plato has a definite notion of heaven and being with the gods and so forth. But if you don't believe that you're going to have the kind of Christian conception of heaven, then it becomes, what are you going to do with your life now? Right? What if that is the end? And Cicero and others talk about this. What if everything just stops when we die? Cicero's answer was to look around. For him, it was community, to build up your state, to be a great politician, to serve others. It's going to all sound very Christian in the values, which doesn't mean Cicero was a Christian. He did some things not too Christian, but like he executed a bunch of people. However, but you can have values. And you see this in another tradition called Epicureanism. Some of you may know this as well. Epicureanism became it's the predecessor of the secular humanist lifestyle. Thomas Jefferson and Karl Marx are the two most famous Epicureans of modern times. And their answer was, if there's nothing after death, and we think there is nothing, we have to have community right here, right now. And so community, we're going to create our own communities, we're going to work and serve each other and so forth. But when you're not oriented toward the same summum bonum, it's interesting to me because the lifestyles don't, in the end, look all that different, even though they're headed in presumably very different places at the end.
Well, presumably, though, there's going to be some kind of transcendence to that project, right? So whatever your community that you're trying to build, and Marx is a nice example where it's like, well, actually, there's a really large community that you're trying to build, and that becomes the super kind of like transcendent thing, which will live on past your death, right?
That's exactly right. So Marx is probably, I hope they're teaching you, Marx thought that we need to improve material conditions right here, right now. That's all there is. There's not going to be anything else. So if we can't make people's lives better now, make them richer, we're failing the human race. Now, we probably debate how well that worked out with his idea. But that was Marx's take. Thomas Jefferson, same thing. They thought that the United States would be this new Enlightenment project. We're going to make people happy in the here and now and this sort of thing.
But reading Cicero, I think one thing that to admire maybe is a kind of courage, right? Of like, you know what, if that's what the world is, if that's what reality is like, then face it with some courage and, don't like rely on a kind of wishful thinking of something else. So maybe to speak in favor of that sort of courage might be one divergence of.
Yeah, let me think, because the Christian virtue is going to be humility, I think. That's completely alien to the ancient world, especially the Roman world. It's all braggadocio in the Roman world because you live in public. Some of you read the Iliad, right? The goal in the Iliad is to have your name echo forever and ever through the ages. The word for glory in Greek is related to the word of calling on somebody's name, kleos. And so that's very different, right? And how do you align with that? Like I said, it sounds very different, but if you want your name to be remembered, you can do great works for other people. I don't think it's all that different from the Christian ideal at the end of the day.
It might look the same, but the motivation is different, right?
Oh yes, for sure. I mean, there's no question of getting into heaven.
So the posture of the heart. I think it's also important to put on the table, though, that the Lord's Prayer was thy kingdom come here on earth as it is in heaven, right? So there's an idea that I think there have been swaths of Christianity that have been so focused on the, whatever, on heaven or what, that what do they say, like, so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good. I feel like that's on some plaque in my grandmother's kitchen or something. She's dead, but, proverbial. But the idea of actually being very much a part of bringing the kingdom of God here on earth is central to Christianity too, and so I want to make sure we're not leaving that part out of the equation either.
Okay, and this is a good point to actually lead into now your role in this next segment, which is you are going to actually continue this conversation at your tables.
Thank you for coming. This has been great so far. I'm super glad I'm here. I think a question that is applicable for a lot of Cornell students is how this Grindset may be tied to like the idea of like parental sacrifice. For example, if you're the child of immigrants. So how do you like address that sort of tension if your Grindset isn't directly related to like your own life, but is a result of like your obligation to somebody that has sacrificed a lot?
The idea that we are atomized individuals sort of making our own path is a complete lie that we need to just put away. All of us have obligations to other people, and all of us have responsibilities, and all of us are in relationships that demand things of us. If you ever have kids, that is like such a game changer permanently. Maybe my kids will hear me now. Completely changes your life. Having a spouse or a partner or a girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever, is a bit of a changer, but kids, complete changer, right? Bringing in an older, I don't know, some of you grew up with grandparents in your home. When that grandparent first came into your home, completely changes the dynamic, right? And so, then it comes down to, are you sort of master of your own life, or are you trying to discern the way to move forward in response to someone who is master of your life? And here I'm talking specifically about the Christian conception of God, right? And so then you have to, Christ is very clear that sometimes you will be called to things that your family might not agree with, right? And so the Christian's response would be to obey Christ and not to obey the family. At the same time, to think that we're going through life, completely on our own and can ignore those relationships is also just wrong. And so I think finding that balance is part of the discernment process. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can give you a very different answer. And it took me a very long time to appreciate this. I was one of the very lucky few people who got to go to college, and my parents said, just study whatever you're interested in. I have not heard many students, I've been at Cornell 20 years, I have not heard many students almost ever in my office hours say the same thing. Your families are well aware that you guys grabbed the brass ring, you're here. They don't want you to do it. And I'm afraid to say that's going to cause probably more stress in your lives if this is the deal you took from your parents than almost anything else. It probably would make some students happier not taking the deal. That's a very difficult thing to say. It's probably even more difficult to hear. But I used to have a friend in the economics department. He says, we have students studying economics. They're not interested in economics. They're interested in Renaissance art history. We have too many people in our classroom. You got nobody in your classroom. How can we make it work? And we haven't figured this out. I fully agree. We are parts of communities, but that's a real tough deal. You could try talking to your parents. They may well not do it. So the other way to think about it is, how would you do it when you have your own kids someday? Would you? I mean, a lot of your parents are having you do this so that your kids can study Renaissance art history or whatever you're going to do. But you can get other cultural enrichment and education around the edges. Even if you're being driven into a certain career track, that doesn't mean you can't cultivate all these wonderful things that you can get at Cornell and in the world.
I wanted to follow up on the very last question about cultivating virtue, and you talked about this a bit, both of you, in your speech, but also when it comes to like intellectual, so you spend your 4 years at Cornell grinding, and then realize afterwards, oh, there were so many classes I could have taken a class on Latin and classics or anything like that. How in your adult lives do you think you can cultivate virtue and follow your interests while also, I guess, existing in this world? Both of you are very deep in your two very different fields, so it'd be interesting to see if you have different answers for that.
Sure. So I'm an ethicist and a physician, but to be an ethicist with a degree after my name, I had to do more school. And so after I was on faculty at Yale, I enrolled in divinity school because that was where I could get an ethics degree. So the first 2 years I got a grant that protected about half of my time so that I could work as a doctor half my time and be a graduate student for half of my time. And then the second 2 years I didn't have any protected time, and I was a total maniac. Talk about Grindset mindset. That was the only thing I knew. But it worked, and I will say it's the best education I've ever had because I was more mature. I had this life experience of being a doctor, and then I was able to study these really incredible thinkers. I did a lot of philosophy actually in divinity school, and it doesn't have to be formal education. There are so many ways now to supplement your education. So I started learning Hebrew on Duolingo 35 days ago. It's my 35-day streak, right? And I'm very excited because I've almost learned the entire alphabet, and that feels like its own achievement. But my point is that there's so many ways to continue to grow and develop. And so if your parents really have high hopes and you feel like there's no negotiation for whatever they're, engineering, law, or medicine, whatever they're calling you to, and you feel like you have no choice but to go forward in that, there are other ways to develop your interests.
Yeah, I think my mic works. If I heard the question at the tail end, you're asking live a life of virtue. How are we doing that?
Like learn to cultivate virtue.
Yeah, so let me give you a different answer. For me, it's by saying no to things that look pretty attractive to most people. So about 10 years ago, my career was sort of going on this really meteoric rise, and I was being looked at for various opportunities, leadership stuff here, there, other places. And you look at the opportunities, and most people think, you'd be a lunatic to say no to this. But then you sit down and you ask yourself, what do I really want out of life, My wife has her career, my kids are happy, they like Ithaca. Why would I give that up for something that doesn't look spectacularly better for all of us? And I think that's part of living in a community, right? You have to really reassess what's going to be best for everybody you care about, and not just yourself. I got to that point by studying the classical philosophers. I think there are other paths to getting there as well. I think within religious communities especially, you're going to find similar advice, but you've got to think really hard about it. And you have to be prepared to say no, which is not so easy to do.
We're going to go with a Slido question next. This one says, how does one break Grindset mindset when it is ingrained in so many structures? For example, take college admissions to academic accolades.
There's no alternative to the Grindset mindset for college admissions. I can't see one. Let's just be honest here. This is a worldwide competition. What is the acceptance rate around here? Something like 10%, more or less? It's even small. It's less now, right? I think at the Dyson School, it's like 0.5% or some insane thing, right? You could throw darts in the dark and have a better opportunity. And since everybody else is doing that, I think that. But I heard you say earlier, Lydia, I agree. It's seasonal, right? You do it for a limited time. The campaign has got to end, and then you got to govern, right? You're at Cornell. You're not competing to get in Cornell anymore. So spend your time doing this. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Thank you. And my question is actually a follow-up to this about the Grindset mindset. And there's a famous quote by Viktor Frankl, and he says, as long as there's a why, there'll always be a how. And I think that, coming back to the Grindset mindset, the Grindset mindset is essentially a how to do something. It's a method. So I sort of disagree with the idea that the Grindset mindset is the problem. Rather, I think a lot of people don't have a strong enough why. And I think a lot of whys are made or created from what other people want, what other people might want from life. And as you mentioned, like saying no to things because it matters to you, it matters to your community, not what you want to say yes to something because it matters to thousands of people. But probably not to you, but it's always tempting because other people might. praise me if I take that opportunity. So I'd say, like, is the Grindset mindset the issue, or is it actually like people don't have a good enough why to engage in that Grindset?
So maybe I'll just say a couple of things. One is, I wonder how much any of you unplugs, or are you always sort of consuming a narrative? Because I think this is particularly pernicious with the younger generation, the college students, because you all, in contrast to the middle-agers up here, you all have grown up being tuned in, plugged in, with more messages coming at you in an hour than we would have in a week, okay? And so how are you unplugging to be able to sort of hear, think, feel, sense for yourselves? Because if you're always being fed a narrative, you're not going to be able to think outside of the box. And so yes, there are seasons of grind. Yes, we live in a culture of achievers and achievement. Yes, that is all true. But I think this gets back to the question also just before, how do you cultivate virtue in the face of that? Well, how are you setting yourselves apart to be able to think, feel, and act differently in the world? And if you're not making a practice of that, then you need to rethink your daily practices. So maybe I'll just start there and see if you can fix it, Mike.
I would agree with what you said, right? I mean, let's say I wanted to be a world-class violinist. There's really only one way you're going to do that, right? I mean, nobody's born, I don't think, being able to do this magic. So you're going to have to grind it up. But if that's what you want, then you've already answered the question. You know what you want. So it's not going to be a problem for you because you're invested in it, right? But I think it's a problem for a lot of people who have gotten everything they've ever wanted by getting good grades, doing well in the SATs. I don't think that makes a lot of people happy long term. I just want to echo one thing. I think social media has destroyed most of us. I say that as somebody who doesn't do social media. I have seen it spread more misery and promote more conformism than I ever thought possible. And I had one of the first Facebook accounts because they rolled it out when I just started here, and it only originally went to the Ivy League. And so somebody said, you should get one of these, and I didn't see the point. But what I see, and I see it happening everywhere, it's making people miserable, and people don't give it up. Boy, that's a habit to break.
Say that Facebook is filled with people.
I'm sure it is. No, you're right about it. The more you can live in the physical world, the happier you're going to be. That sounds really school-marmy, but if you can start jogging, you go outside with your friends, get community groups, you would be amazed. What do the young people say, touch grass? Do I have that right? Yeah. You got to do that. Pet a dog, whatever it's going to be. Get outside, turn that stuff off, and live in the real world.
I'm a veterinarian, and we have another veterinarian at this table, and we have interacted with what we really wanted to talk about, what we felt about what you guys were saying. We interact with the conversation around death a lot, and we're often the first person to bring up the reality and the conversation about death with a lot of people because our pets die faster than we do. Their lifespans are much, much shorter, and it's not just a question of death is coming. It's, we have to make the decision now. And Ariel, you had a great question. Like, you have to answer all the questions of, like, does this pet go to heaven? Or other things, You are the authority in that situation to speak to all of it and to help them, because they have to make the decision. You can't be the one making the decision as the veterinarian. You have to kind of come alongside them, hold their hand, and have them say, yes, I want to euthanize this animal. And a lot of times, these, especially as we've got, in our society, animals are so emotionally attached to us. We are so emotionally attached to our animals. It's true tragedy, and it is true death. And it is the first example that a lot of us have of this coming into our lives and even reckoning with our own mortality. So the question that I get into is, what's, for us veterinarians going into this, what do you guys see any valuable tools or thoughts or preparations for us going into these situations to then prepare everybody else about, it's almost like an inoculation, but, how do we go into those? And what's helpful for us going into those?
I'll just say that have you worked out your own questions and concerns and fears about death? Because it's really important to do that work yourself. Are you having conversations with your family, with your parents, with your grandparents about mortality? And how do those conversations go? What sorts of things do you say? Because if you're doing that work on your own and in your own family and community, then you'll be much more equipped to do that with clients in the veterinary clinic. I think working on this stuff yourself is the first step.
Yeah, so it's tricky, right? There is a famous quotation by the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus. He says, when someone is in the throes of grief, you meet them on the, I'm translating badly here. When somebody's in the throes of grief, don't preach a different philosophy from what they already believe. You meet them where they are. So if this person comes in and the pet is dying and they are not prepared for the death of or you have to euthanize the dog, and they believe in pet heaven, I would probably play along with that belief as much as I could within my own comfort zone. I don't see, you're only going to increase their misery by saying, oh yeah, they're not, to the end. Right. Well, but this comes up constantly, eating meat, right? I mean, eating fish. It's all over life, right? And so this is where I find the Christian worldview quite challenging, the belief that humans are uniquely endowed with an afterlife, but all the animals are somehow totally different. This is, it's in the Bible and stuff, but as you know, other faith traditions take this differently. Secular traditions take this differently. So that's advice for in the throes of grief. I think pet owners, and I don't think you can control this, need to prepare far in advance for the end of a pet's life. You have to understand, when you buy the guinea pig, it's got a limited number of years, and that's it. But a lot of people won't get it, and that's tough.
My question is more for Dr. Dugdale, but I'm sure Professor Fontaine also can shed some light. You mentioned that medicine has sort of added a veneer that dying is optional, and I was wondering how in your work as a physician you lifted that veneer for your patients and how we can apply that in our own lives.
Great, thank you. So I talk about death with all of my patients. Partly, it's a requirement for anyone age 50 and over. Actually, there's a checkbox that I have to bring up end-of-life wishes, so it's easy. For younger patients who are hospitalized, it will come up because we have to know whether we're going to be doing resuscitative measures or not, if God forbid something really terrible happens. So it comes up regularly. Can you just, sorry, give me, I lost the nugget of what you wanted. Lifted the veneer, that's right, okay. How have I lifted the veneer of death being optional? So here's the thing. All of us have things that make us feel really uncomfortable. That's just true. Now I might start sounding stoic, so you'll have to tell me why. But part of the way that we become more comfortable with them is by sort of hanging out in that space through approximation, right? So I remember my first day as a real MD, and I was walking into Yale New Haven Hospital, and it's one of only 2 times in my life when my knees were knocking together, and I felt them knock, and it was like knocking knees is a weird sensation. But by the end of my 10 hours in the hospital, there was 0 knee knocking, and the knees never knocked again in the hospital, right? Those knees were tired. So you spend enough time with something that makes you uncomfortable, and it becomes less scary. It becomes sort of more normal. So why is it that death has become so fearful in the modern era? Well, if you look at the last 100 years, we went from mostly dying at home to mostly dying in institutions, and most of us have not spent much time at the bedside of someone actively dying. Very few people in this room, if I asked you to raise your hands, would probably raise your hands. But it used to not be that way. Between infant mortality and child mortality and the fact that people died by age 40 or 50, your life was over. All people were seeing death all the time. And then this was reinforced with community practices. So if we're really going to lift the veneer, as I said and you said, then we need to just sort of make death a little bit more part of the conversation. I once wrote an article published in some online thing about making the case for Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving we just had, as the day when we should talk about death with our communities. Why? Well, Thursday is all about Thanksgiving and good living, and then Friday you get up and go shopping thinking about good living. So, if living well is tied to dying well, then by the end of Friday, you should sit down with your loved ones and talk about what it means to die well. The article was published on Black Friday, but I don't know that many people have made this a habit, probably no one. But how do we bring conversations about death back into the rhythms? And again, it doesn't have to be morbid, it doesn't have to be crazy, but just to sort of acknowledge that it's part of life. It's a given, and so we need to prepare.
Yeah, our last question here is from Slido. It has the most upvotes. It says, Professor Fontaine, have you retained your first place title in the pizza eating contest? And how might Cicero have responded to this community display of leadership?
Somebody's been playing around on my CV. I once won a pizza eating competition. I did pretty well, actually. So the question is, how would Cicero respond to gluttony? Well, there are different ways of characterizing it. It was short-term gluttony, so I would not recommend you do competitive eating competitions. I can make you very happy. Yeah. I wanted to just follow up a tail end on what you were saying. I have no insights, but Dr. Dugdale's book addresses that end of life very eloquently, that circumstance of being at the bedside. And I recommend you read it. I think it's really quite affecting to see what we're talking about, because death has gone into institutions, out of sight, and it's not around us like it used to be. You should read the book.
If you could join me on thanking our speakers tonight.